Well, it's great to be here, and let me again thank Avner and Jim for another flawless execution of this conference, including the fresh powder, so I gotta give them a hand for that. It's great to be discussing this paper. Adriano and Vish have developed this very elegant theory of financial frictions based on collateral constraints, and in this paper they look at an application to risk management, and in particular some, as you know, empirical results related to the airline industry. I'm in a little bit difficult situation in the sense that, you know, it's mostly an empirical paper, and Adriano, I knew, would do a great job presenting the theory, so the amount of value add for me is going to be on the low side, but I'll do my best. Let me give you the big picture. Financial frictions create a motive for risk management. Right? There's a wedge between internal and external capital. We want to reallocate internal capital to high-value states. This is true in their models, true in many models of financial frictions, one of the things I'll point out. And their model based on collateral constraints, firms can only pledge a fraction of invested capital, and the credit constraints are going to bind when net worth or pledgeable collateral is low. And so you want to shift cash flows into low net worth states. And in a dynamic context, because hedging also requires collateral, hedging becomes therefore too costly when net worth is already low. And that's really the main, the key result and the key intuition from their paper, as Adriano very effectively explained. So their empirical strategy then is to look for this negative relation between net worth and hedging, and they focus on the airline industry where nicely we have some quantitative hedging measures so we can actually see how much hedging they're doing. Okay. Now let me just start by saying one of the really nice things about this paper is very careful about really dissecting this motive for risk management and how we should think about it from a theoretical perspective. A lot of misperceptions about that. The popular press, of course, you see you know, very often statements like this, which is that, you know, somehow hedging gives firms a cost advantage. So Southwest enjoys a major cost advantage over competitors because it's hedged fuel prices at below market prices. And what's very nice about this paper is it really makes the intuition very clear that it's obviously not about that. It's about shifting net worth, and that's not the right way to think about it. Right? So hedging doesn't directly affect real decisions. Contracts are for fixed quantities, so we can think of them as lump sum transfers, no change to marginal input and output prices. The value of hedging has to come from relaxing financial constraints in some way. Okay. And so what's the story around that? And their model is not new in this. We've had models of financial frictions for a while, and people have looked at these implications, which is that, you know, if we think about the enterprise value of the firm, in the first best, it would be independent, in a frictionless world, to be independent of the amount of initial net cash or pledgeable collateral that the firm has. With financial frictions, though, we say, well, when that's really low, it's going to be constrained, and those financial frictions are going to impose some cost on the firm. We get this sort of concave value function for the firm, right? And that concave value function then leads to some potential value from risk management. And so that's the usual intuition. We can think of, you know, this is enterprise value excluding the cash, of course, adding it in to get the equity value. We get a picture like this, but we still get that concave shape because of those financial frictions. Okay? And in addition, you might argue from this picture that, well, you know, when there's a lot of cash, a lot of collateral, we're basically linear here, so the value from hedging is going to be relatively low. Where it's going to be most valuable is when the firm is more constrained and we're in that more concave region. And so just thinking about it like that without thinking about the dynamic implications, you might think, okay, so we'll see more hedging when firms are financially constrained. Right? When firms are more financially constrained. And that's kind of just the general intuition that's been out there in the literature, and Adriano provided some quotes from various papers along those lines. Okay. Now, I should say, of course, this concave, this relationship is quite general. There's lots of models that have it. We could think about, you know, tax benefits to get some concavity there. We can think about costly external finances and Fruit, Sharfstein, and Stein. Bolton, Chen, and Wang have a recent paper that studies risk management in the context of transactions costs associated with external financing. This paper focuses on collateral constraints, and in particular, no enforcement beyond next period's pledgeable collateral. Okay? So no outside equity, fully collateralized state contingent borrowing and saving. That's the key thing, as Adriano explained in the model. So we want to think about this as we can trade complete markets, but anything we do has to be fully collateralized based upon the available collateral we have at the moment. I just want to mention a call out to my colleague Francisco and co-author a very nice paper that just explores evidence of the value benefits from hedging in a study based on use of weather derivatives by energy firms. And they have a nice, well-identified empirical study where they take a look at that and do find evidence of this value effect, that we can increase value through the use of risk management in this way. Okay, so let me talk about, again, the main intuition in the model that Adriano presented and why we don't get this, why we're going to see firms not hedge when they're severely financially constrained, right? So what's the story? If we just thought about a one-shot model where we had, two states next period, one where the marginal value of collateral is low, one where it's high, we want to risk manage and we want to shift from one to the other, right? And that was, thinking about that picture we had before, what we'd want to do in a one-shot case. And when we think about a dynamic model, though, you really have to remember that hedging really involves credit. There's a credit component to a hedging transaction. And so rather than thinking about it this way, we should really think about it in this way. What we're doing is we're going to borrow against some pledgeable collateral that we have in the low in the low state here, and then invest that in securities that will pay off when marginal value of collateral is going to be high. Okay? And so that's what we would do. But of course, if in this earlier period we also have some investment needs, right? In fact, if this is where the highest marginal value of capital is, then we're never going to do this part, right? It's going to be better to just borrow everything we can and bring it back here rather than push it up here. Okay? So if we're already in a very constrained position today, marginal value of capital is really high right now. Anything that we have available that we can pledge, we want to use that to invest or avoid disinvesting today, as opposed to use it in some future state. Okay, and that's the key intuition of the model. Okay, it's a really nice intuition. It works very well, although I want to just kind of talk about some other things that could be going on as well, and that could lead to similar implications. And so, not clear exactly what the right story is. So first thing I'll mention is, the way we think about shocks in the model can matter in terms of how we interpret things. So if you think about hedging a temporary shock to cash flows, so a great case would be, weather or something like that. It's a temporary shock, not a persistent thing. We think about a farmer who's got some crops and is worried about how weather might impact output price. Then this picture works really well, and you can think about, well, I want to hedge. I want to reduce that volatility of what my cash output is going to be because of this concavity here. But if I think about a world where there are persistent shocks, then really a large part of what's going on is changing the investment opportunity set going forward, right? And then the hedging direction becomes less clear, and we could have other sorts of things going on in a dynamic model. So imagine here we are today, and just suddenly there's a change in fuel oil prices. It doesn't have an immediate cash flow impact on the firm, but it changes kind of my investment opportunities going forward. And so the real picture in that case, when you think about a persistent shock, is, this is a picture, let's say, when fuel prices are high. This is the value function when fuel prices are low. And so now the shock is moving me from one of these curves to the other. Right? And so how you want to hedge depends upon, again, you want to smooth that the marginal value of collateral across states. And so in particular, if we were if we had a sufficient amount of collateral, then across these two curves, that marginal value is equaled across these points. And so you would want to move cash into the case where fuel prices are high. You'd like to have more cash in that state, and you'd be willing to have less cash in a state where fuel prices are low, because you're going to be more profitable than you'd be generating lots of cash anyway. But if I move down to this end of the curve, then you could have a scenario like this one here, where now as I get more constrained, now I'd like to shift the other way. Because maybe it's really costly for me to be very collateral constrained at a time when this industry is very profitable to be in, and I want to grow a lot. Right? And so I might want to shift cash in the other direction. And how that's going to play out is going to depend a lot on what you assume about the underlying technology and what how the investment possibility frontier shifts as I move from one state to the other. Okay? So the point here is that we could get this sort of effect of hedging when we have a lot of collateral and not hedging when we have less collateral for reasons other than just a pure collateral constraint story here. That it's a little bit more, the dynamics can be more complicated, and it would be nice in the paper to understand what, if anything like this is playing a role or if not, and sort of teasing out what assumptions about the production technology might drive this or not. Okay. The other alternative I'll mention is, of course, the risk-shifting alternative. If we had an abandonment option in this case, or if we had levered equity, so actually I should have redrawn this to shift that equity curve down and have the usual option, hockey stick on the bottom, then of course that's another reason why we might not be hedging in low collateral states. So those are sort of two alternative rationales why we might see this inverse relationship that the paper documents, and it'd be nice to kind of tease into empirically a little bit more distinguishing them. So let me turn to the empirical study. What are the goals of the empirical analysis? In some sense, I think the paper is kind of focused on the idea that we just want to show that there's no hedging when net worth is low is not contradicted, and kind of document that in the data. But I think I would like to sort of elevate the ambitions of that empirical section of the paper to really understand which financial frictions are responsible for that. Is it the model that you have in mind? Could it be related models? And could we somehow tease that out in some way? The other thing I'll mention is on the cross-sectional comparison, the measure of hedging that's used in the paper is a fraction of next year's fuel cost hedged. Now, when you think about that cross-sectionally, you start to think about what about natural hedges the firm might have. In particular, might airlines differ in their ability to pass fuel costs on to customers? So, demand elasticity is likely to depend on the percentage of business travel that you have, and that's likely to be different across airlines. Your ability to cut less profitable flights segments might depend on sort of the network structure of your flight arrangement. And just doing, I dangerously kind of tried to do a little bit of regression myself. Some simple regression of operating income on fuel prices showed higher sensitivity for Southwest than many others, even though Southwest was the most hedged. And so I think to understand the cross-sectional results better, it would be useful to do some more analysis of, well, how sensitive are their profits ultimately to fuel costs? And that might be very different across airlines. So some airlines might need to hedge more just to get to the same overall sensitivity for their profits. And so that's just something that I think the paper could explore in more depth. Testing collateral constraints. Are collateral constraints the right measure of financial frictions? Evidence from the 10K statements where they explicitly discuss it seems pretty convincing. The paper does use some different measures of net worth in their analysis, market net worth versus book net worth. And so, for example, I'm wondering if they should think about a little bit more does their model make some predictions maybe about which is the better measure, and can they somehow try to tease that out as well to try and understand, again, which are the frictions that are really driving the results that they're seeing. Changing the investment opportunity.